I'm Blake Hollaway, and welcome to the Jotted Journal podcast, a series of stories written and read by me. Today, I'm reading The Job Offer, and is a part of the Fact or Fiction section of our podcast. Is this story inspired by truth, or is it a complete work of fiction? Join our production assistant tier to cast your votes and find out. Take a seat, get comfortable, and let me take you to another world. The brightness of the California sun was beginning to rise over the palm trees, causing streaks of light to stream in through the tinted windows of the makeshift bedroom. Despite the early morning freezing temperatures, the sun was beginning to bring warmth back into the city. The comforter she had slept with was now bunched around Cameron's waist. One long, tanned leg had made its way on top of the blanket. A sheen of sweat was already glistening off her forehead. Cameron shifted in her little sleeping space. She attempted to stretch out her stiff legs, but frowned when a bloom of pain erupted when her ankle collided with the plastic that was too close to her feet. She groaned in irritation, the pain enough to aggravate her, but not enough to fully wake her from her sleeping state. She had gone to bed early enough, but the sleep she had gotten was not only dissatisfying, but altogether terrible. Although the confined space was safer than the alternative, it left little room to stretch out. The makeshift bed beneath her, although extremely comfortable to sit in, was designed for just that. Lying down left her body in an awkward angle and was in no way a flat surface. And to make matters worse, the thick comforter had done little to ward off the mid-morning chill of the desert and been far too much for the early morning heat. She had considered sleeping in the front, but the windows in the back were far more tinted, and since it was technically illegal for her to be sleeping in the car, she was afraid to risk it. She had street parked on a relatively quiet and safe Hollywood street, but the fear of being watched while she slept had still been a very real fear. She had started awake many times throughout the night to the many sounds of the city. Cameron shifted again in an attempt to get comfortable. The sun was now streaming brightly through the windshield and directly into her eyes. She draped an arm over her face and attempted to place the other above her head. It banged hard into the plastic, and she groaned as pain radiated through her wrist. Slowly she opened her eyes, squinting as they adjusted to the brightness. With aching muscles, she sat up. She yawned and took in the state of herself. Her neck was stiff, and a rather strong ache resided in her left knee from having remained bent throughout the night. She rubbed at a sore spot on top of her head and sighed again. In her attempt to stretch out as much as possible in her sleep, Cameron had pressed the top of her head into the plastic of the side of the car. A sudden noise caused her to turn to face the window behind her. She froze. A disheveled man with an unruly beard stared back at her through the rear side window. He was wearing a brown bathrobe that had parted to reveal a thick tuft of chest hair. His hooded eyes went wide when their eyes met. The hell? Cameron thought aloud, swinging her legs to the floor and shifting her body to reduce the strain on her stiff neck. The man took off running as Cameron clumsily crawled over the center console of the front seat and made her way out the driver's side door of the yellow coupe. Her legs protested as she made her way to stand, staring after the running man. He was running rather awkwardly, and it became very clear to her why, when the pants he'd been attempting to hold up fell to his ankles as he turned a corner. As the realization of what he'd been doing sank in, Cameron wrinkled her nose and cursed under her breath. Disgusted, she opened the door and reached into the back seat to gather her blanket and pillow. Making her way to the back of the car, she did her best to shove the bedding into the trunk. It was still full of boxes from her move cross-country. Slamming the trunk closed with a hard thunk, Cameron grabbed her keys and phone before making her way down the street. Her apartment was nestled in the middle of Hollywood, just a block north of Sunset and a few blocks down from the Walk of Fame. As she approached the 6-story white concrete building, she pulled out her key. Approaching the vintage front door, she slid the key into the lock. After a few minutes of fiddling with the old stubborn metal, it finally clicked into place, and the door creaked open on its hinges. The apartment building had been built in the early 60s, and would have had a vintage charm to it had it been kept up. As Cameron made her way through the foyer, her shoes tapped against cracked tile. The crystal chandelier dangling above had long gone out, leaving the vintage hall lights the only light in the dim building. The banister of the vintage staircase wobbled under her hand as Cameron made her way to the second floor. Upon reaching the correct door, she used a different key and slid it into the lock. It refused to turn. Cameron cursed. What the? Cameron pulled out the key and inspected it before trying again to unsuccessfully unlock the door. Parker changed the locks, a voice said from behind Cameron and down the hall. Cameron turned to see her landlord's girlfriend standing in the hallway, her arms full of groceries that were protruding out of the tops of paper bags. Cameron sighed. Guess I don't have the new key. Is Jerry home to let me in? She asked, referring to her landlord. The girlfriend shook her head. He's at work already, she said. Right, Cameron replied. Movies have to have an editor. Cameron's tone was more acidic than she had intended, and the girlfriend stared at her for an awkward moment. Well, thanks for telling me, she added. The girlfriend nodded and continued down the hall. When she disappeared, Cameron cursed and kicked the door with a loud thud. God damn it, Parker, she hissed before sighing loudly and turning to leave. Parker and Cameron had moved out to LA together. They had been friends at one point, but that had ended abruptly shortly after arriving in Los Angeles. Even though Parker had landed a job immediately upon arrival, she hadn't done well with the transition. It had only taken a few nights for her to begin locking Cameron out of the apartment whenever Cameron didn't come home at the time that Parker deemed appropriate, which changed often and appeared to be more of an excuse than anything else to take over the apartment. And upon the few occasions Cameron had come home and been allowed in, the experience had been so unpleasant that Cameron had come to prefer sleeping in her car just to avoid the arguments and the fighting. Cameron might have felt bad for Parker, even had felt so in the beginning of what appeared to be a pretty substantial mental breakdown. But after several months of this erratic behavior, the lack of being able to get a job, and with her little bit of money she'd come to LA with dwindling, her empathy had quickly turned into apathy. Cameron had quickly lost all patience with trying to compromise with Parker and had committed to completely avoiding her when at all possible. They had both known how uncomfortable things were going to be. The apartment they moved into was a studio apartment with no kitchen and one tiny closet and bathroom. They'd both known it was a temporary fix until they both had gotten on their feet. But things had been far harder than they'd imagined upon arrival, and now things were entirely unbearable. But changing the locks? This was a whole new level, even for Parker. Cameron checked her watch as she finished brushing her teeth in the handicapped stall of the coffee shop bathroom. She'd bought the toothbrush and toothpaste at the 99-cent store, with the spare change she'd wrangled up from her car. It'd been the longest and most embarrassing $2 checkout she'd ever experienced, as the clerk had counted the various pennies and coins for the transaction. Honestly, she wouldn't have bothered if it hadn't been for the fact that she had a meeting set up with another alumni this morning. She spit out the toothpaste and rinsed the toothbrush before replacing it in the backpack that housed all her essentials. She'd done the best she could to look presentable under the circumstances, but she hated the fact that her shirt was wrinkled, and she hoped the shower she'd had from the sink would be enough to ensure the lack of any foul odors. With a steadying breath, she picked up her backpack and exited the bathroom. Several minutes later, Cameron was shaking hands with Marcus. Marcus was working as a producer for one of the big studios and had been one of the bigger contacts she'd been given to meet with through her connections. However, due to his busy schedule, it had taken 3 weeks to set up a meeting with him. As they waited in line to order coffee, Cameron couldn't help but feel anxious. It was customary at meetings like this to buy coffee for the person that you were meeting. Cameron just hoped the transaction on her credit card would go through, being that it was so close to her credit limit. She'd already spotted the least expensive coffee on the menu and was hoping Marcus wouldn't notice when she ordered it. Marcus interrupted her thought process when he turned to her suddenly. "You like Americanos?" he asked. Cameron nodded. Marcus stepped up to the counter. "2 Americanos, please. Venti, iced and black." Cameron's stomach flipped. The Americanos Marcus had ordered were much more expensive, bringing her balance dangerously close to maxing out her credit card. As he began to pull out his wallet, Cameron reached over to hand her credit card to the barista. Before the barista could take the card, Marcus snatched it from Cameron's hand. "This one's on me," he said, handing the card back to her. Cameron made way to protest, but Marcus silenced her with a hand and a kind smile. "Nonsense. You just arrived here. I know how difficult that can be financially. I've got this one," he said, handing his black American Express card to the cashier. Cameron thanked him, and they waited in silence a few moments before the coffees were handed over. As Marcus handed off the coffee to Cameron, he said, "I hope you drink it this way. Sorry, I just realized I assumed you drank your coffee black because you're from the East." "I do, actually. You were spot on, thank you." Marcus loosed a sigh of relief and said, "Okay, good." The two found a secluded table in the corner and sat down. "So, obviously you want to work in the entertainment industry. But do you know what you want to do in the industry?" he asked. Cameron nodded. "Well, sort of. I think I want to produce and direct mostly." Marcus took a sip of his coffee and nodded. "TV, commercials, or film?" he asked. "All of them," Cameron replied. He chuckled. "That's quite the feat. I'm sure some of my colleagues have already talked to you about how segregated the industry can be." Cameron nodded. "Well, I'll skip that lecture then. Instead, I'll tell you what I tell everyone I meet with. I hope what I say doesn't dishearten you. It may not be what you want to hear, but it is what I wish someone would have told me when I first came out here." "Okay," Cameron said, mentally preparing herself for whatever he had to say. "The film industry is a giant game of chess. It's going to take you 2 years before you start meeting the right people. If you make it to your 3rd year, that's where you're going to start realizing if you actually like LA, or the entertainment industry in general. It'll take you 5 years before you begin to get where you want to go, and if you make it to 5, that's where you'll know if you want LA to be your home or not." Cameron and Marcus stared at each other for a long moment. "I'm going to do all that in 3 years," Cameron finally said. A slow grin spread across Marcus's face. Good, because I have a job for you, if you want it. As you find yourself settling back into this world, I want to take a moment to thank all our listeners for joining me for this Bholla Entertainment production of the Jotted Journal podcast. If you love the show and want to help others find it, feel free to give us a shout out on social media and share our Patreon page, www.patreon.com/Bholla Entertainment. You can check out some of my other content by following me on Instagram or TikTok or subscribing to my YouTube channel at Blake C. Hollaway. See you next week and holla at you soon.